The body was discovered in the root cellar of the Blackwood estate on April 17, 1879. It had been there for exactly 76 days, according to the later testimony of Dr. James Morrison, the county medical examiner. What made this discovery particularly disturbing wasn't just the advanced state of decomposition or the way the body had been positioned, but the meticulous documentation found alongside it, a leather-bound ledger containing 412 pages of handwritten entries, each one detailing a specific debt that had finally been collected. This would become known as the most calculated act of vengeance in the history of Salem County, Massachusetts. But the most chilling aspect wasn't the murder itself. It was the 18 months leading up to it, when Elizabeth Caldwell systematically dismantled Thomas Blackwood's life piece by piece, all while serving as his trusted housekeeper. The authorities did everything in their power to keep this story from reaching the public. The trial records were sealed, the newspaper accounts censored, and witnesses were paid for their silence. Before we continue the story of Elizabeth Caldwell and the revenge that shocked Salem County to its core, make sure you're subscribed to never miss these hidden chapters of American history. Comment below which state you're listening from, because stories like Elizabeth's happened in communities just like yours, with secrets still buried in courthouse basements across the nation. What I'm about to reveal comes from recently discovered personal journals, medical records, and testimony that was sealed for nearly 150 years. This is the complete, unfiltered account of how one woman's meticulous planning led to the most methodical act of vengeance ever documented in New England history. Salem County in 1877 was a place defined by stark contrasts. The textile mills along the Merrimack River had created unprecedented wealth for a select few, while most residents struggled to survive on meager wages. The red brick mansions of mill owners stood in sharp contrast to the cramped wooden tenements where workers lived 6 to a room. It was two different Americas existing side by side, separated by invisible boundaries that everyone understood but no one acknowledged. The Blackwood estate sat on 15 acres of manicured grounds on the north side of town, set back from the road behind a wrought iron gate that remained closed to all but the most privileged visitors. Thomas Blackwood had inherited the property and the mill from his father in 1872, along with a reputation for business acumen that bordered on ruthlessness. At 42, Blackwood was at the height of his power and influence in Salem County, with investments in everything from railroads to real estate. Standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, perfectly trimmed beard, and penetrating blue eyes, Thomas Blackwood cut an impressive figure. His clothing was always impeccable. Custom suits from Boston, shoes handcrafted in London, gold cufflinks that caught the light when he gestured during his frequent speeches at town meetings. But those who worked for him knew that his polished exterior concealed a man of savage temperament and vindictive impulses. Elizabeth Caldwell had been born in Salem County in 1853, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had come to Massachusetts during the potato famine. Her childhood had been one of grinding poverty and constant hunger. Her father had found work in Blackwood's mill, standing 14 hours a day at a loom that slowly destroyed his lungs with cotton dust. By the time Elizabeth was 12, her father was coughing blood into handkerchiefs that her mother would boil clean each night. When he died at 36, the Blackwood mill gave the family 3 days to vacate their company housing. Elizabeth's mother took in washing and mending to keep them from starving, her hands cracked and bleeding from lye soap and cold water. Elizabeth learned to read by studying the labels on merchandise in the company store and borrowed books from the children of more fortunate families where her mother sometimes worked. By the time she was 20, Elizabeth had developed into a woman of uncommon intelligence and quiet determination. She had mousy brown hair that she kept pulled back in a severe bun, unremarkable features, and a slender build that made her appear younger than her years. What most people failed to notice about Elizabeth was the intensity of her gaze, the way her dark eyes seemed to absorb every detail of her surroundings, cataloging information for future use. When her mother died of pneumonia in the winter of 1877, Elizabeth found herself alone and facing destitution. The factory jobs paid starvation wages, and single women without family connections had few options for respectable employment. It was in this moment of desperation that fate intervened in the form of a notice in the Salem County Gazette. Sought, housekeeper for prominent estate. Must be literate, detail-oriented, and of impeccable character. Apply in person to the Blackwood residence. Elizabeth recognized the opportunity immediately. Working as a housekeeper for a wealthy family meant regular meals, a roof over her head, and wages that could be saved rather than immediately spent on survival. She presented herself at the Blackwood estate the next morning, dressed in her mother's one good dress, carefully mended and pressed for the occasion. The interview was conducted by Mrs. Harrington, the current housekeeper who was leaving to care for an ailing sister in Providence. She was impressed by Elizabeth's intelligence and obvious desperation, the latter being an advantage in her eyes, as it meant the girl would work harder to keep her position. "The work is demanding," Mrs. Harrington explained, leading Elizabeth through the cavernous kitchen with its gleaming copper pots and massive iron stove. "Mr. Blackwood expects perfection in all things. The linens must be changed daily, the silver polished weekly, the floors scrubbed each morning before dawn. He takes breakfast precisely at 7, dinner at 6, and requires the house to be silent after 9 o'clock. Elizabeth nodded, absorbing every detail. "I'm not afraid of hard work, ma'am." "It's not just the work, girl," Mrs. Harrington lowered her voice. "It's the man himself. Mr. Blackwood has exacting standards. He notices everything, forgets nothing, and tolerates no mistakes. The last scullery maid was dismissed for placing a teacup with the handle turned the wrong direction." "I understand, ma'am." Mrs. Harrington studied Elizabeth's face, perhaps seeing something of herself 20 years earlier. "See that you do. This position will feed you and keep you from the poorhouse, but it will cost you in other ways." Elizabeth was hired that afternoon. Thomas Blackwood himself conducted the final approval, spending less than 2 minutes assessing her before nodding curtly. "You begin tomorrow," he said, his voice cultured but cold. "Mrs. Harrington will explain your duties. I expect loyalty, discretion, and competence. Provide those, and you will find me a fair employer." Elizabeth curtsied, her eyes downcast. "Yes, sir. Thank you for the opportunity." That night, as she packed her few belongings in the tiny room she could no longer afford to rent, Elizabeth had no way of knowing that she had just taken the first step on a path that would lead to one of the most meticulously planned acts of revenge in American history. The first 6 months of Elizabeth's employment at the Blackwood estate passed without incident. She learned the rhythms of the household, memorized Thomas Blackwood's preferences, and made herself as invisible as possible while performing her duties. She rose at 4:30 each morning to light the fires and prepare the house before Blackwood emerged from his chambers. She retired to her small room in the attic long after he had gone to bed, often spending 17 hours a day on her feet. The work was exhausting but not unbearable. What made it difficult was Blackwood himself. Just as Mrs. Harrington had warned, he noticed everything and criticized mercilessly. A speck of dust on a banister, a wrinkle in the tablecloth, a slightly overdone slice of toast, all were cause for cutting remarks and withering glares. "I see attention to detail is not among your virtues," he might say, running a finger along a picture frame and displaying a barely visible smudge. Or, "Perhaps if you applied yourself with greater diligence, my shirt cuffs would not be quite so limp." Elizabeth absorbed these criticisms in silence, her face a mask of subservient contrition. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood. I'll do better, Mr. Blackwood." But behind that mask, something was changing. With each cutting remark, each dismissive gesture, each reminder of her position as a servant rather than a person, Elizabeth was compiling a mental inventory of offenses. Then came the incident with her mother's locket. It happened on a Tuesday in October, 7 months after Elizabeth had begun working at the Blackwood estate. She had always been careful to remove the small silver locket, her only inheritance from her mother, before beginning her duties each day. She kept it wrapped in a handkerchief in her room, taking it out only at night to polish it with a soft cloth and remember the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep her daughter alive. But on this particular morning, exhausted from staying up late to prepare for a breakfast meeting Blackwood was hosting, Elizabeth had forgotten to remove the locket. It wasn't until she was serving coffee to Blackwood and his business associates that she realized her mistake. The small silver oval was visible at her throat, peeking out from beneath her high-collared uniform. She might have escaped notice if one of the guests hadn't commented on it. "What a charming piece," the man said kindly. "Family heirloom." Before Elizabeth could respond, Blackwood's voice cut through the room like ice. "You are here to serve, not to engage in conversation or display jewelry," he said, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth with cold fury. "Remove yourself until you can present yourself appropriately." Elizabeth felt her cheeks burning as she backed out of the dining room. The humiliation was sharp, but manageable. It was what happened afterward that changed everything. That evening, Blackwood summoned her to his study, a wood-paneled room lined with leather-bound books he rarely read and hunting trophies from animals he hadn't shot. He was standing by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand, when Elizabeth entered and curtsied. "The locket," he said without preamble. "Give it to me." Elizabeth's hand went instinctively to her throat, though the locket was no longer there. "Sir, your behavior this morning was unacceptable. You embarrassed me in front of my guests with your inappropriate display. The locket is clearly distracting you from your duties." "Mr. Blackwood, please," Elizabeth said, her composure cracking for the first time. "It was my mother's. It's all I have of her." "Which makes it a distraction you cannot afford," he replied coldly. "Your employment here requires your complete attention. Personal attachments are a luxury for those who can afford them." When Elizabeth hesitated, his voice hardened further. "The locket, or your position? Choose now." With trembling hands, Elizabeth removed the locket from her pocket and placed it on the desk between them. Blackwood picked it up, examining it briefly before dropping it into a drawer. "You may earn it back through exemplary service," he said, though his tone made it clear this was unlikely. "Now, prepare my evening tea and see that the fire in my bedroom is properly banked. I have correspondence to complete before retiring." Elizabeth curtsied mechanically and left the study. But something had fundamentally changed in that moment. The careful mask she had maintained for 7 months cracked, revealing something underneath that would have terrified Thomas Blackwood had he been perceptive enough to see it. That night, in her attic room, Elizabeth Caldwell began a journal. The first entry, written in a neat, controlled hand, read simply, "Today I have decided that Thomas Blackwood must lose everything, as I have lost everything. Not quickly, not publicly, but methodically, completely, and irrevocably. This is my vow." Over the next 18 months, Elizabeth transformed herself into a student of Thomas Blackwood's life. She observed his habits, his weaknesses, his fears, and his desires with the focused attention of a naturalist documenting a new species. She noted that he was afraid of illness, constantly washing his hands and avoiding contact with anyone who showed signs of sickness. She observed his vanity about his appearance, particularly his thick dark hair, which he brushed 100 times each night. She catalogued his business dealings, his social connections, and the careful facade he maintained in public. Most importantly, she began to understand the complex web of lies that supported Blackwood's position in Salem County. The rumors of mill workers crushed in machinery and buried quietly at night. The young women from the factory floor who were summoned to his office and later dismissed when their conditions became visible. The creative bookkeeping that shorted workers' wages while expanding his personal fortune. Elizabeth recorded everything in her journal, which grew from 1 volume to 3, filled with observations, quotations, and carefully formulated plans. She wrote at night by candlelight, storing the journals beneath a loose floorboard in her attic room. During the day, she continued to perform her duties with impeccable attention to detail, earning Blackwood's grudging approval and, more importantly, his complacency. "You've become quite efficient," he remarked one evening as she served his dinner. "Mrs. Harrington chose better than she knew." "Thank you, sir," Elizabeth replied, her eyes downcast to hide the calculation behind them. "I live to serve this household." It wasn't entirely a lie. Elizabeth had indeed dedicated her life to the Blackwood household, just not in the way her employer imagined. The execution of Elizabeth's plan began in the winter of 1878, 13 months after the incident with the locket. It started small, so small that even the observant Thomas Blackwood failed to notice. A misplaced letter here. A slightly altered message there. Small discrepancies in household accounts that suggested inefficiency rather than malice. Elizabeth began intercepting Blackwood's mail, steaming open envelopes and making subtle changes before resealing them and placing them on his desk. An appointment time shifted from 2 to 2:30, causing him to arrive late and flustered. A business associate's offer modified just enough to cause Blackwood to respond inappropriately, straining a valuable relationship. She started adding small amounts of salt to his evening brandy, not enough to be detected, but sufficient over time to create an association between the drink and a mild feeling of unwellness. She rearranged items in his study by fractions of an inch, creating a subtle sense of disorientation. She began replacing his hair tonic with a solution of her own creation, containing ingredients that would, over months, cause his prized dark hair to thin and lose its luster. Each action was meticulously documented in her journal, along with observations about its effects. December 12, 1878. Mr. B arrived 15 minutes late to meeting with railroad investors due to altered note. Observed him sweating and apologizing, behaviors previously unknown. Railroad expansion may be delayed. As winter turned to spring, Elizabeth escalated her campaign. Having earned Blackwood's trust through her efficient management of the household, she had been given increased responsibilities, including some oversight of his correspondence and schedule. This gave her new opportunities to create chaos in his previously ordered life. She began targeting his business affairs more directly, using her knowledge of his operations to sow seeds of doubt among his associates. An anonymous note to a business partner hinting at financial irregularities. A carefully worded comment to the wife of an investor about Blackwood's unfortunate entanglements with factory girls. A misplaced decimal in an important contract that would not be discovered until months later. By summer, Thomas Blackwood was showing visible signs of strain. His once immaculate appearance had begun to deteriorate. His hair was noticeably thinner, his complexion sallow, his hands slightly trembling when he lifted his morning coffee. He had begun drinking earlier in the day and was sleeping poorly, calling for tea at all hours of the night. "I don't understand what's happening," he confided to his doctor during one of the increasingly frequent house calls. "Everything seems to be going wrong at once. Projects failing, associates becoming distant, physical ailments I've never experienced before." The doctor prescribed rest and reduction of stress, advice Blackwood was constitutionally incapable of following. His empire was showing cracks, and rather than step back, he became more controlling, more demanding, and more isolated. Elizabeth watched it all with the patience of a spider, recording each new development in her journal with clinical precision. June 17, 1879. Mr. B dismissed from Bank Board of Directors following confusion over loan documents. Observed him breaking glass in study afterward. Hair loss now pronounced at temples. Weight loss approximately 20 pounds since January. The most devastating phase of Elizabeth's plan targeted Blackwood's reputation, the thing he valued above all else. Using information gleaned from his private papers and conversations overheard while serving dinner parties, she began orchestrating the collapse of his social standing in Salem County. She arranged for rumors of financial impropriety to reach the ears of key investors. She ensured that evidence of his crueler business practices found its way to local ministers and community leaders. Most damaging of all, she compiled testimonies from 7 young women who had been mistreated and discarded by Blackwood over the years, creating a document so scandalous that even a whisper of its existence was enough to close doors that had once stood open. By fall, Blackwood's decline was apparent to everyone in Salem County. His business associates avoided him, invitations to social events stopped arriving, and there were whispers of bank foreclosure on properties he had mortgaged to cover mounting losses. The mill continued operating, but production had decreased amid rumors of unpaid suppliers and wage reductions. Through it all, Elizabeth remained the perfect housekeeper, efficient, attentive, and increasingly indispensable to a man whose world was collapsing around him. She prepared his meals, managed his dwindling household staff, and provided a steady presence in an increasingly chaotic life. If Blackwood noticed that his downfall had begun shortly after Elizabeth Caldwell entered his household, he gave no indication of it. Then came the final act, the one that would transform Elizabeth's revenge from extraordinary to legendary. On a cold evening in January 1879, as snow fell silently outside the increasingly empty Blackwood estate, Elizabeth served dinner as usual. Thomas Blackwood sat alone at the massive dining table, a shadow of his former self. His hair had receded dramatically, his clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his hands trembled as he lifted his wine glass. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Elizabeth asked, standing at perfect attention beside the table. Blackwood looked up at her, really seeing her perhaps for the first time in nearly 2 years. "You're still here," he said, his voice slightly slurred from the wine. "Everyone else has abandoned me, but you remain. Why is that, I wonder?" Elizabeth's expression revealed nothing. "I made a commitment to this household, sir." Blackwood laughed bitterly. "A commitment?" "Yes. More than can be said for those I considered friends and associates." He took another drink of wine. "Do you know, Elizabeth, there are days I think I might be going mad? Nothing works as it should. Trusted colleagues betray me. My health fails without explanation. It's as if some malevolent force has targeted every aspect of my life. Perhaps it's simply misfortune, sir, Elizabeth replied calmly. Or perhaps it's the natural result of one's actions returning to them in kind. Blackwood's bloodshot eyes narrowed. What do you mean by that? Only that in my experience, sir, we often reap what we sow. Elizabeth's hand moved to her throat, to the place where her mother's locket had once rested. Some debts eventually come due, whether we remember incurring them or not. A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, or the first inkling of understanding, crossed Blackwood's face. He opened his mouth to speak, but Elizabeth continued before he could form the words. I've taken the liberty of preparing something special for your after-dinner tea, she said. A blend I think you'll find most illuminating. Will you take it in the study as usual? Still staring at her with newfound suspicion, Blackwood nodded slowly. Yes. The study. 30 minutes later, Elizabeth entered the wood-paneled room carrying a silver tea service. Blackwood was standing by the fire, warming his hands against the winter chill that seemed to have settled permanently in his bones. Your tea, Mr. Blackwood, she said, setting the tray on the desk. As she poured the steaming liquid into a delicate porcelain cup, Blackwood spoke without turning from the fire. It was you, wasn't it? All of it. The failed meetings, the lost contracts, the rumors. Somehow it was all you. Elizabeth added precisely 1 teaspoon of sugar to the cup. Would you like lemon with your tea, sir? Answer me. Blackwood turned, his face flushed with anger and realization. Have you been systematically destroying my life? Oh. Why? Elizabeth picked up the cup and saucer and crossed the room to where he stood. Your tea will get cold, Mr. Blackwood. You've always been most particular about the temperature. He knocked the cup from her hands, sending porcelain and hot tea scattering across the expensive carpet. Tell me why. For the first time in nearly 2 years of service, Elizabeth Caldwell looked Thomas Blackwood directly in the eyes. What he saw there made him take an involuntary step backward. Do you remember a silver locket? She asked quietly. A simple, inexpensive thing of no value to anyone except the daughter who received it from her dying mother's hands? Blackwood's brow furrowed, then cleared as memory returned. That trinket. This is about a piece of jewelry. No, Mr. Blackwood. This is about power. This is about a man who believed his position entitled him to take whatever he wanted from those beneath him. Their labor, their dignity, their treasured possessions, their very humanity. Elizabeth's voice remained calm, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made Blackwood take another step back. This is about a man who destroyed my father in his mill, evicted my dying mother from company housing, and then took the one thing I had left of her, not because he wanted it or needed it, but simply because he could. Because watching another person's pain gave him pleasure. Understanding dawned fully on Blackwood's face, followed quickly by fear. You can't prove any of this. No one would believe a servant over a man of my standing. Elizabeth smiled for the first time, expression devoid of warmth or humor. Your standing. Look around you, Thomas. What standing remains? Your business associates avoid you. Your investments are failing. The bank is preparing to foreclose on this very house. The mill operates at a loss. Your health deteriorates daily. What exactly do you think you still possess that anyone would covet or believe in? She moved to the desk and opened the drawer from which she had seen Blackwood retrieve documents throughout her employment. From it, she removed a small silver locket. I could have taken this back at any time, she said, holding it up to the firelight. You never locked this drawer, never suspected that someone like me, someone beneath your notice, could possibly represent a threat. That was your first and greatest mistake. Blackwood lunged suddenly, reaching for the locket with desperate hands. Elizabeth sidestepped easily, watching as he stumbled against the desk, breathing heavily from even this small exertion. The tea was poisoned, wasn't it? He gasped, clutching at his chest as realization struck. You've been poisoning me all along. Elizabeth replaced the locket around her neck for the first time in 18 months. No, Thomas. The tea tonight was just tea. Exceptionally bitter, but still just tea. The brandy, however, has contained small amounts of various compounds for over a year now. Nothing immediately lethal, just enough to gradually undermine your health while remaining undetectable. She moved to the bookshelves and removed a leather-bound volume, opening it to reveal not pages but a hollow cavity containing a small vial. This, on the other hand, would have been immediately lethal. A mercy I considered but ultimately decided against. Death is too quick, too kind for what you deserve. Blackwood collapsed into his chair, his face ashen. What do you want? Money. The deed to the mill. Name your price. I want you to understand what's happening to you, Elizabeth replied, replacing the hollow book. I want you to experience exactly what my father experienced in your mill and what my mother experienced in that company hovel. A slow, agonizing decline while watching everything you valued strip away piece by piece. She walked to the study door before turning back to face the broken man. You will live long enough to see the bank take this house, to watch the mill pass to new ownership, to witness your name become synonymous with failure and disgrace in Salem County. You will experience poverty, helplessness, and the particular humiliation of depending on the charity of those who once feared you. Why not just kill me? Blackwood whispered. Elizabeth's expression softened slightly, not with compassion but with something closer to professional pride. Because death is an event, Thomas, while suffering is a process. You taught me that. Over 18 months, I've conducted a masterclass in suffering, with you as my only pupil. Now the lesson is almost complete. She paused at the threshold. I'll be leaving your employment tonight. Your household accounts are in perfect order, one of my few professional courtesies. You'll find that most of your remaining funds have been donated anonymously to establish a hospital wing for mill workers suffering from respiratory ailments. The paperwork is irreversible and bears your signature, a reasonable facsimile, at least. Blackwood stared at her with a combination of hatred and horrified respect. You planned every detail. From the moment you took my locket, Elizabeth confirmed. Every detail, every contingency, every possible outcome. I've lived for nothing else. You've become a monster, Blackwood said hoarsely. Elizabeth fastened her cloak and picked up the small valise she had packed earlier that day. No, Thomas. I've become you. The finest student you never knew you were teaching. 3 days later, when the housekeeper from the neighboring estate came to check on why smoke hadn't been rising from the Blackwood chimneys, she found Thomas Blackwood dead in the root cellar. Beside his body was a leather-bound journal, the first of 3 volumes that detailed every aspect of Elizabeth Caldwell's systematic dismantling of his life. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure, though the coroner privately noted that he had never before seen a heart failure victim with such an expression of absolute terror frozen on their face. Elizabeth Caldwell disappeared from Salem County that January night and was never seen there again. Some reports placed her in San Francisco years later, operating a successful hotel under a different name. Others claimed she moved to Chicago and became a respected matron managing a women's boarding house. A few rumors suggested she established herself as a financial consultant in New York, specializing in helping women secure their economic independence. The truth about Elizabeth's fate remained as carefully guarded as the details of Blackwood's death. The authorities in Salem County, many of whom had private reasons to despise Thomas Blackwood, ensured that the journals were sealed and the more sensational aspects of the case suppressed. The official record stated only that Thomas Blackwood died of natural causes following a period of business reversals and declining health. But the story persisted in whispered conversations, in fragments of memory passed down through generations of mill workers, in the unexplained donation that established the respiratory ward at Salem County Hospital. It survived as a reminder that power, no matter how absolute it might appear, always contains the seeds of its own destruction, and that sometimes those seeds are planted by the very hands thought too weak to matter. The most disturbing aspect of Elizabeth's revenge was not its outcome but its method. The patience, the precision, the willingness to dedicate almost 2 years of her life to the systematic destruction of another human being. In her final journal entry, found in the root cellar alongside Blackwood's body, Elizabeth wrote words that would haunt everyone who read them. Some will call what I've done evil. Others might call it justice. I call it education. For 18 months, I taught Thomas Blackwood what it means to lose everything that matters, just as he taught so many others before me. The lesson is complete. The debt is paid. The ledger is balanced. What do you think? Was Elizabeth justified in her methodical revenge, or did she become the very thing she despised? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to hear more hidden stories from America's past. Because in the shadows of our history, the most chilling tales are always the true ones.